Welcome to 50/50 Books, the book review podcast where the books are split in two, and figuring out just what is going on is always a toss-up. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Jonathan. This episode we are finishing up Lone Women by Victor LaValle. So Taylor, I would love to hear your general vibe of the book. One thing I noticed was that it ended up being a lot more queer than I anticipated.
For sure, definitely. While I was looking through trigger warnings, I kind of got a hint of something, but it was more present than I thought it would be, I will say. General vibes for the book, though, it definitely picked up in the second half. We got a lot more characters, I feel like a lot more storylines, which was interesting. I definitely liked the second half more than when I was reading the first half.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a short book, you know? I feel like it could have been longer.
Yeah, I totally agree. I felt like, particularly with the last quarter of the book or so, which I feel like I'm repeating myself from a previous book, but the last quarter of the book or so went quite fast, and it ended kind of, even timeline-wise, before I thought it would. Like, it does kind of a hop ahead at the end to the new town they go to, but it did feel like, oh, like, there could have been more of a reflection moment, you know, a lessons learned conversation in these end parts, but I did like that it was a lot more, there was a lot more interaction between characters in the second half of the book. Like, the first half is really setting up the, you know, she's moving to a new place by herself. She's kind of only interacting with a few people, and there's kind of some weird vibes about it. Like, the second half is really, you know, we alluded to it at the end of the first half, that it'd be more focused on the town and the people in it. And I did kind of like that shift into relationship more.
Yeah, it did become interesting that it is lone women, right? But it's lone women in the plural sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of part one, though, we did talk a bit about performance and like honesty and everybody in this town seeming nice enough to certain people. We weren't as anti-town, I guess we'll say, in the first part. We had no reason to be, I guess, but... And
they even tried to seem welcoming and stuff. I mean, obviously we had our issue with the news guy being, you know, clearly ignoring Adelaide, but it seems like otherwise, like, oh, shockingly welcoming for this town, you know?
Yeah, but it definitely reads a bit more of, like, kind of what Grace and Adelaide do at the beginning as well, like measuring each other, right? And kind of seeing who's going to be useful, I guess. Just because the second part of this, we really dive into certain other characters, like the Reeds, and how they're operating things here, and just how much darker it is, I guess, as dumb as that sounds.
No, you're right? Like, they are performing, right? There's this surface level of, like, this is what we want people to see, because it helps us get what we really want. And if they knew what we really wanted, or if we named what we really wanted, it would seem as unsavory as it really is.
Right. Like, we specifically get a scene of Mrs. Reed kind of propping up this other woman saying, you should support her laundry business. It's, like, so innovative and it's great. And, like, all of that sounds good on the surface, right? Like, you want innovation. Maybe not in our time period, but you want most innovation and you want to support women who are trying to start business and all of that. But then the rhetoric is so, like, clearly also ask who's doing your laundry now. And the person doing it now is Fiona. And it kind of just enforces that, like, anti-Chinese sentiment that's crazy, like, running rampant during this time period in this area, right? And it's the same rhetoric we hear now as well, right? Like, immigration issues and people stealing other people's jobs and, like, all of that kind of nonsense.
Right. It's so targeted, right? Like, she does really call Fiona out. And I was thinking about this because I wasn't really sure what the Busy Bees organization was. And, like, I tried to do a little Google search to see if this was a real thing. And if it was, I couldn't find it, at least immediately. But it seemed like the goal was for it to be, like, a feminist group. But of course that, like, ends when you bring race into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even to the degree, like, especially with this sort of nonchalant way that Mrs. Reed talks about Birdie, like, just she describes her as, like, a woman of color, but that's kind of it, right? Like, she doesn't put an opinion on it. So I'm like, okay, it seems like Mrs. Reed is not obviously a racist, right? But then, yeah, when it comes to the Chinese folks, right, there's, like, it's like, yeah, she is obviously racist. And I wasn't sure if that meant that her judgment of Birdie that we kind of see more later on had to do with race, or if it just had to do with the fact that she was selling alcohol and, like, that doesn't align with her interests.
That's possible, because this is, what, 1915? So it's about Prohibition time period.
Mhm. And they're saying that the busy bees are pushing prohibition.
Yeah, and because that was a really big feminist issue. And we should specify, like, this is white feminism, right?
It
like
is absolutely white feminism.
Very
Yeah.
different than what feminism should be. And then you have Prohibition, which was a feminist issue because of basically men getting drunk and then beating women is really what a big issue was during that time period. I mean, it still is. And alcohol is an easy excuse for deplorable behavior. But yeah, so I could see that especially if Mr. Reed is going there, right, to visit Birdie and getting drunk and like doing all of that stuff. It's probably
right.
Of course, Mrs. Reed isn't going to blame her husband. She's going to blame the person supplying the alcohol.
Yeah, that's actually, I didn't even think about that for some reason, but she does have a personal beef with it, I'm sure, given the way we see Mr. Reed behave over there. Like, if she has any knowledge of that, which I'm sure she does, then it wouldn't even matter. Like, yeah, I think the other parts wouldn't matter as much as, like, you are helping my husband misbehave.
Yeah.
I mean, so Mrs. Reed has one set of concerns. Mr. Reed has another set. We mentioned the alcoholism, but also he's hired Job. I still don't really know what the right way to say that
Job.
is. The audiobook said Joab, but once you said Job, I stopped believing that it should be Joab. So, but Mr. Reed, like, not only does he hire Job, but he kind of has a manipulative level of control over him.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of that relationship that kind of gave like grooming vibes, not necessarily with like a sexual connotation, but just like we know him and his wife don't have children. It felt like he was trying to kind of shape Job to kind of take that place, which we see later with like Job becoming a Reed, kind of. And then obviously Mr. Reed kind of has Job become a strangler. And I'm like, this boy is like 13.
Yeah.
Give him a break. I don't know.
But Mr. Reed he's playing those manipulative cards. He's making Job feel like he's part of a family, like he has a purpose, right? So he really can, like, basically he's positioning himself in a way that Job will feel like he owes him, right? It's like Mr. Reed has done all of these things for me. He's given me identity. He's given me purpose. So why wouldn't I do everything he asks? And I think that's exactly what Mr. Reed is looking for here. Like, maybe it is in one part that he doesn't have a kid and thought he was going to have a kid and wants a kid, but like, this is not, I mean, unless this is the relationship he was planning on having with his actual kid, like, this is not really a parenting relationship. This is like I'm going to be able to get you to do my dirty work kind of relationship.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's room for both. Like, I think if the Reeds did have children, they would want the perfect child, right? Like, considering what they did to their previous child, which we can talk about later, but they would want somebody like Job who feels loyalty to an extreme degree. So I think this is just insight into what that because I think parenting is a big theme in this book. So I think this kind of gives insight into how they would have dealt with parenting.
Yeah, honestly, it doesn't feel that different from the actual the mother of the Mudges, right? Like, she's quite, I would say, manipulative. She raised her kids to be a certain way for a certain benefit. I guess it's really not that different. And yeah, like, Joab is kind of, he's already been groomed for it. Yeah,
and it's kind of funny in like the worst way, because part of the reason Job feels such loyalty is when Delmas gets attacked and he's like dying basically on the ground. Fiona to Mr. Reed is like, you should help that boy, because Mr. Reed is only thinking about his horses basically. So the only reason Mr. Reed helps Delmas is because of what Fiona says, but in Job's perception, he doesn't see that interaction, so he thinks that's Mr. Reed acting for his family, right? And that kind of enforces that loyalty. It's just like so crazy, because Fiona's doing it out of actual kindness, right? But it's like, it doesn't really matter who's making the decision. It like matters who's the face of it, kind of, right? Like, who's the face of that.
Yeah, who gets the credit.
Yeah.
I have to say that part was a little hard to believe. I don't know if I was supposed to take it a little bit more because he was drunk. But the fact that Fiona's able to change his mind to save Delmas, I was like, it didn't really feel like enough convincing to me. But
that is a good point, yeah. I guess, yeah, because of the drunkenness and just like optics. Like, how do you look if you let the boy die instead? Maybe it was just a remembering of that situation.
Yeah.
Not that it really matters, I guess, because Job does end up killing Delmas later.
Yeah. In front of Mr. Reed, for that matter.
Yeah, and Mr. Reed does nothing to stop him. If anything, Mr. Reed is probably happy about the situation.
Yeah, he's like one less thing to worry about. I mean, he even says like, "Oh, you defended me." I don't remember those are the exact words, but he assumes that Job killed Delmas as revenge or like to somehow protect Mr. Reed because of the horse thing, or I don't know. But he takes it as like a +1.
Yeah, because I think Delmas was about to tell the truth about who he and Job are, and obviously Job couldn't let that happen because then he would be killed. And it just causes like a fracturing of Job's like whole mental state, I guess is a good way to put it. Because now he's like loyal to this person who let him kill his brother. He's lost his entire family. He's kind of being pushed into this new family, but like they're obviously not good people. It's just kind of a mess.
I think at this point when he kills his brother, he's already kind of accepted that he's part of this new family, though. I think that's the only reason he's willing to do it, because we see him before be pretty affected by the loss of his 2 older brothers. And so I think his thing is less so, at this point, he's not really seeing Delmas as brother. He's seeing Delmas as a risk to him and his newfound family. So that's why he's willing to do this, even though he had talked so strongly about wanting to protect family before.
Yeah, at this point, it's kind of like survival, right? Like looking out kind of for himself for the most part, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. He's just a kid in a tough spot.
I understand that.
You know?
Yeah. He's literally like a child, but he killed his brother over it. And honestly, I don't know. Maybe the truth should have been coming out. Delmas just had that whole like come to Jesus experience with Elizabeth too. So it's not really Delmas's fault.
Yeah, it's just tough because Job is also working on his mother's logic, right? Where survival is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just like, yeah, survival is everything. That means I have to kill my brother.
My God. Yeah. I did think it was funny that like the Delma situation brought to me a question of, does Elizabeth have a moral response to the people she interacts with? So like she, in those chapters where it's presumably in Elizabeth's head, she seems to just target any food, right? Like she's like, I'll eat the horses or the humans. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just whatever I come across first. And that kind of seems to hold true in that scene when she's going for the horses until Delmas brings attention to himself. But then she still does kind of excuse Delmas after he starts begging and pleading. So I had trouble understanding like what level of thought was Elizabeth putting into things? Was she actively excusing him, or did that not actually matter? Was that just how Delmas, interpreted the situation?
I think she understands, because when Adelaide comes to her later and is kind of like, give me another chance, like I think she obviously understands people, and like I don't know how literate she is, like how much she understands actual language. It's hard to say with her upbringing, but she must understand enough to like see a younger person, because Delmas is also a boy, right? And him like pleading, and she must understand that situation. So I think she was working with morality in regards to like letting him live, basically.
Yeah. I think that's right. It's just weird. Yeah, I think you're right too that it seems like she does have some language faculty. Like she's able to listen to people and understand, at least in English, understand what's going on. So we never get that sort of in Elizabeth's head, how she's feeling about those situations or responding, or like, when Adelaide is kind of saying, don't, excuse this boy, please, like things like that. We never really see inside her head for that.
Yeah, the most we really get is like her having obvious issues with Adelaide and like not wanting to say her name, and like their relationship being odd. But I think that makes a lot more sense when we think of Adelaide having almost been kind to her and like trying to be kind to her, and then that being kind of taken away.
Right.
So that kind of struggle. Before we get into all of the Elizabeth stuff, though, we might as well just wrap up the town. I feel like that makes the most sense, hopefully, probably. So we have talked about it being kind of a performance, and people end up being horrible. By people, we kind of mean the Reeds, but like also
the Reeds, yeah.
Also we have the Kirbys, which were Finn and Matthew. I guess we can't blame Matthew too much.
I mean, Yeah, it's like I feel like I felt more bad for him in the first part than I did in the second part. Because in the first part, I'm like, yeah, like you shouldn't have opened the trunk, but God, what a fucking punishment, you know?
Yeah.
But then in the second part where like he starts the campaign, I'm like, ugh, I can't deal with you.
It makes sense though, right? A woman comes to town. If we ignore anything like racial about it,
Right.
just looking at the cold hard facts,
Right.
a woman comes to town with a demon in her trunk. She's probably a witch and everybody's going to die. Like, I feel like
Yeah.
that's an okay assumption for him to make.
That's fair, I suppose, yeah. I guess that's a good point. I guess it's Mrs. Reed's actions after that I'm more upset with.
Right, because it's not just we should confront Adelaide and, like, sort this out type of situation. Mrs. Reed decides to gather everyone, play music like an insane person.
Yeah, that was weird.
Kidnaps Sam with some, transphobia mixed in, because it turns out Sam is trans, and hangs or attempts to hang Grace, Birdie, and Fiona. So this is crazy.
The thing is, like, I wouldn't be surprised if Matthew knew this is what the response would be like, because one of the things I was thinking about, I said last episode, the whole it only take one thing for all of this to turn around on Adelaide, right? And that made me really nervous. But like the thing wasn't small, right? Like it was not a small thing that they decided to target Adelaide on. It was in their perception, demon creature trying to kill them all. So he must have known that like the response would have been quite major and probably wanted that, right? Like I don't think he's super upset by the like attempted lynching here.
I think the carnage we get at the end of the book and who ends up dying makes sense for the most part. Like, it's the Reeds, it's, I think, most of the Busy Bees, it's the Kirbys, like, the people who kind of set up this whole performance, right, of this lynching. The bystanders are the bystanders. They just showed up, I think, to the opera house. And yes, they didn't stop it, which isn't great, but they didn't really know it was happening, I guess.
I suppose, yeah. It's just weird. Yeah, I was trying to understand more if it was like a full like hive mind situation where all the townspeople were in on it or not, because Mrs. Reed does a lot of we statements when she's setting everything up. Like she's speaking for the whole town all the time, which like it implies some sort of, at least, yeah, like passive approval, but maybe that's not the case.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think this town would hate if these women were killed, because we have Grace, who has a trans son, and that's weird. We have, Birdie, which is a black woman, and then we have Fiona, who's Chinese. It's like, if these are the people that we're hanging, so be it.
Right. I mean, it's no accident that the only women of color in town are on the chopping block.
And if it means like the town can be as prosperous as Mrs. Reed seems to claim, then I feel like a lot of these white people would be okay with it.
Right, exactly.
Which is crazy, but like, that's what we're dealing with.
And like it's bad, but Mrs. Reed is vile, right? Like she is the most extreme version of this. Like she's willing to manipulate that idea.
And I think those we statements she makes definitely, like, it is all manipulative, right? Because it's if any of you decide you don't want to be part of this, then you become one of the other.
And she does make a pretty strong point about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's still no reason for, like, not standing up for what's right in this moment, but it makes it harder, right?
Yeah, it's not like the natural thing. Like you really have to go out of your way and be, like, acknowledge something is going wrong, process that something is going wrong in a way that you then do something to stop the thing that's going wrong, which then still might not work. So it's oof. I hate it.
Yeah. So it does make sense that Adelaide at the end of all of this is kind of like, the bystanders can go.
And I guess they do make the point that she has some ability to encourage Elizabeth to go for or not go for certain people already.
Yeah, for sure. Starting at the second part of this book, these two characters were not friends. Kind of. They had a weird relationship, but suddenly the creature, Elizabeth, is listening to Adelaide. How did this happen? What is the creature? I will say pronoun-wise, Elizabeth is given she, her, kind of, but like in Elizabeth's POV, it still uses like it, its.
Oh, honestly, I didn't even notice that.
It does
Yeah, I kind of
sometimes.
switched to saying she once she got the name Elizabeth, and they started sheing her, you know?
Yeah, so I'm like, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if the it's is like a result of her upbringing and like how that went.
Yeah, it's I'm also kind of confused about that, like what the claim is on what she is, because it's yeah, it almost sounds like, man, like you guys just chose to raise her in a way that limited her, and maybe had she been raised more fully, like it wouldn't have gone this way, but then she would still physically be different. And so then but then she would have been birthed by a human, so it's like where I don't know where we are on like, I guess she's still like, she could have been a person, but she's not a human, right?
It's kind of a weird like nature versus nurture. Like I don't think we'll entirely know fully what she could have been because she was birthed, right, by Eleanor Henry, which is Adelaide's mom. I guess Adelaide just lied to us at the beginning. She did not show up on the doorstep.
Yeah, she just yes.
I mean, it's possible that could have been the secret Eleanor had. Like maybe Adelaide was raised believing the creature had just shown up, or like maybe that was a lie she told herself. I don't know. We don't really get clarification on that. So.
Yeah, we don't like see the mom again, but I kind of assume that this was the secret, right? It was that the secret that the mom was keeping was that she birthed Elizabeth directly, and it wasn't that Elizabeth was dropped off.
Yeah, and I could believe that. But yeah, there is also no reason as to why Elizabeth is born this way. She just kind of is. It definitely gave me Jersey Devil vibes. I mean, it did in the first part as well, but I was like, the creature wasn't born or birthed, and turns out she was.
Yeah. Yeah, and not the only one to be birthed for that matter, but
yes, for sure. So it seems like it's just like a random occurrence if it's happening to the Henrys and also the Reeds.
Yeah, because there wasn't really like a digging into a reason why, right? Like something they did to kind of get this response. Also interesting that Adelaide was born with a creature, and it seems like Mrs. Reed just had the creature.
That's true.
Like, it's not inherently a twin situation.
Right. And Adelaide was also born with like almost the ability to subdue and like touch the creature, right? Like they were born very much as a pair.
Yeah. Which just maybe just like the twin thing, but
yeah.
The other thing I was going to mention in response to the Jersey Devil thing was that it reminded me too of like the chupacabra, because that is described as being lizard-like or reptilian and vampiric, specifically going for blood and targeting livestock, right? Like the stories are that the livestock were found with like teeth marks under them and without blood. So I don't know. To me, that like really like that pushed in the chupacabra direction. I mean, the thing that most made me think this too was like when the couple comes in and they start speaking Spanish to the creature, and I was like, oh, they're trying to make a point here. This might be a chupacabra, but that also might not be correct. I thought that was like the woman makes a comment about Elizabeth not even knowing her own language, which I assume she was referring to as is Spanish. And that's where I was like, oh, I think I'm bothered by this, because now they're gonna say like this Hispanic couple came in and started, praising Elizabeth as a god, and assume that it's, just like assuming that it's some creature that belongs to another culture, which I'm like, I don't know. I guess that can be done fine, but I just didn't. I always get afraid when parts like this happen in a book where I'm like, does the author know what they're doing here? And like, do I trust the author to know what they're doing here in a way that's not offensive? And given that it appealed to the chupacabra idea, I was like, okay, I can take some ownership over this one, because that's a Puerto Rican folklore. So, and it did make me a little bit uncomfortable. But then you did some research before this and found another possible route. Do you want to talk about that?
It's not that I did research and found a route. It's in the book, the couple mentions a specific like city, which is in Mexico, and like refer to Elizabeth as like a goddess basically, which has like Aztec roots based on the city. So it's like, I didn't think they were trying to like godify Elizabeth. I kind of saw it as like when you see something you don't understand, you think it's a demon, right? Or you think it's something celestial, possibly.
Right. It's like different people's reactions to the same supernatural thing, right?
Right, yeah, for sure. Because they like gave Elizabeth offerings, which is like the first time that's ever happened to her, and it was very strange for her. I don't know if I think it was needed. I guess other than to kind of reinforce that idea, like I just mentioned, like some people will see a demon, some people will see a god. It just depends on perspective, I guess.
I think it might have also just been to show how it could have been different, right? Like how Elizabeth could have been appreciated and respected, and how it didn't have to be that Elizabeth then became just like a feared killing machine, because she obviously doesn't kill them, and not that means we should have gone the total other direction, because that could have also, brewed an actual kind of demon version of Elizabeth where that's all she knows. But yeah, I think it's just that perspective of like everyone has chosen, every time they've come across one of these creatures, they have chosen to, keep it down, kill it, hide it. But this is the first people who come through and are like, no, we can appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. And it also might be important for Adelaide to kind of see that relationship as well. Like, these people kind of took Elizabeth in, but like allowed her distance still and kind of worked more on her terms and didn't fear her, weren't killed by her. Like, it's a very different situation. And Adelaide was kind of punished for thinking that kind of relationship could exist, because the Henrys immediately were like, we can't kill Elizabeth, that's our daughter, and then proceeded to lock her in a barn for 30 years. Like, make it make sense. I don't understand.
So I guess we can go from talking about what Elizabeth is a bit more higher level into what she represents in this story. One of the things we talked about a lot in the first half was the idea of shame, which I think did kind of stick as one of the things she represents. I think there's more to it than just that, but that definitely maintained.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth ended up with more agency, I guess, than I was assuming, because I was expecting like high level. She just is symbolic of something, but she is kind of just like a person that was treated badly, and like that upbringing, of course, would bring shame onto Adelaide, and that's more so what that shame is, rather than this like amorphous idea of shame, right?
Yeah, I kind of like your angle on that, because the other thing I was going to bring up was shame, particularly like connected to basically, I mentioned last episode a little bit thinking of Elizabeth as a representation of intergenerational trauma, especially because she's at that time described as something that showed up when Adelaide is born, as opposed to being born with her. But she only really becomes that for Adelaide because of the way she is treated, right? Not because of her inherent existence. It's because her parents were like, this is how we interact with Elizabeth. Like, this is her position in this family, and her position is a secret, a thing that needs to be, the world needs to be protected from, a thing that we are responsible for, and especially a thing that you, Adelaide, are responsible for. But without those things, with like a more positive approach to Elizabeth, that didn't have to become like an extra weight on Adelaide, right? It might have not necessarily been normal, right? Like, Elizabeth looks a certain way, and that might have come with something else societally, but it didn't have to be from within the family that this weight was carried. I guess in a way, I do still think she represents, or it represents feels less strong, because she just kind of is, in a way, intergenerational trauma for them, for Adelaide.
Yeah, because we do get like this sibling dynamic between them, which is actually like really good, like well done. It's like happens quick in a moment, barely there, but it does make a lot of sense, because Elizabeth obviously was mistreated her entire life, but Adelaide still has kind of a resentment towards Elizabeth. We knew that because Adelaide has to kind of take care of her, and that is its own problem, but also being raised with somebody like that, they're getting bad attention, but the issue is they're still getting attention, right? And Adelaide kind of lets that feeling fester, and she deals with it in the second part of this book, of kind of like feeling hateful towards Elizabeth, because everything was about Elizabeth, right? And obviously actual sibling dynamics don't have it in this way, in which one of them is like a creature, but that's still very true, right?
I mean, I definitely saw that when I was teaching, as far as the bad attention thing, right? People do respond to that, and other kids will get jealous of it and then behave poorly themselves. So it's a thing.
Right. And then I have like 3 siblings, so
yeah,
I for sure understand this sentiment. Crazy.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of like a these are all issues that were created and enforced by the parents, right? Like, which is kind of what you just said anyway, but I feel like it really needs to be discussed what these parents did. I don't know. It's just, I just can't understand the mentality of being like, we can't kill this kid because it's our kid, but we're just going to treat them like absolute garbage their entire life. Like, it's just so mind-boggling because we get, in the first part, I had mentioned, like, who did Elizabeth kill? Because I wasn't sure what the creature had actually done. And it turns out Elizabeth had escaped one time and killed some sheep and some cows, and then had done nothing else until she killed her own parents because they were trying to kill her.
Yeah. That's still so chupacabra, just saying. The sheep thing, I forgot about that. That's like on the nose, honestly. Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like it was kind of just a reaction to, like, especially like when she was born, like I think the midwife got bitten or scratched or something, and that kind of just immediately set things off on the wrong foot of like, oh, this is a dangerous being.
Well, to be fair, also the midwife was going to go kill Elizabeth.
Oh yeah, like right, she was gonna repeat, or I guess do another version of what the Reeds did.
Right.
This is maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but one thing that this made me think of on a more abstract level, given the light sexuality mentions in this book, it kind of reminds me, you know, keeping secrets and shame and all of that stuff. It kind of reminds me of when parents like don't accept their kids for being gay or coming out with a non-straight sexuality, and kind of either, or even if they don't come out, this can happen, right? Of like just feeling repressed and not able to show it, or like, you know, feel like that is a part of yourself you're allowed to engage in, and how that like can really stew, you know, a lot of resentment and like and behavioral differences, even because of what that does to you, like emotionally, and you know, the things that causes, like depression and anxiety and etc., right? Like how that can really change who the person is because of the experience that they're having being repressed. So like, to me, it felt like that, where it's like maybe it kind of parallels a situation where a kid isn't necessarily like disowned or kicked out or any of those things, but is still forced to behave a certain way or keep things down, or just like they haven't come out with it at all and don't feel like they are safe to do so. And so they keep on living the way they were, and like the parents still technically take care of them, but there's a distance and like maybe even a lack of commitment, especially in the cases where they do come out.
Right, which is a very interesting like idea, I guess, when it's held against what Grace is willing to do, right? Because Sam is out. Sam dresses like a boy. Grace refers to Sam as her son, and all of that is very clear. She's obviously distanced herself from the entire community because she's willing to do that. And we get a very interesting kind of moment between Job and Sam, and Job is just like baffled at this idea that there could be a parent that just genuinely loves their child and wants them to be happy. Like, it's never, he can't fathom it because his mother was all about survival and like all of these terrible things. And obviously Job doesn't understand this Elizabeth situation, but it's kind of the same thing. Like, the Henrys kind of weren't willing to put in that love, I guess. We don't know what the very beginning of their life was like with Elizabeth, but I think we can assume from what's being talked about, and like Adelaide being a girl trying to sing to Elizabeth and being beaten because of it, like we can assume it probably was a very long time in which Elizabeth was in this terrible situation. And it's just like Sam is within this book is so very distinct from that. It really is just like a, how do you make good people in the world, right? Like, you love them. That's all you need to do, right? You need to love them and you need to accept them.
And I feel like even Adelaide, like, has that realization herself when she starts creating resentment for her parents, right? Of like realizing like, oh, like it actually could be different. It could have been different. And like, you guys chose to go this route instead and have like formed me in that image too. So now that I resent it, like, I think she that's why things change for her at a certain point.
Because she has her own issues, right? Like, she's not part of a community. She feels isolated. She feels burdened. Like, she has her own things that she has to deal with because of what her parents did. And coming here and meeting Grace and kind of also becoming close to Sam, it is just like, yeah, she just completely changes. She finds a family, basically, and is
Yeah.
able to connect with her sister. And that all just took acceptance, and it took love, and it took second chances, and it's just, what else do you need?
Yeah. And it's all in stark contrast to the Reeds literally just killing their kid the moment it's born.
Yeah.
Primarily Mr. Reed, but...
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like Mrs. Reed accepts that decision.
Yeah, she's like, it's what had to be done.
I am curious, though, because it's not... I don't think she was ever given the choice, right?
Mm-mm.
She had just given birth. And I think her mother-in-law was the one who told Mr. Reed, like, you have to kill the baby.
She
and
was
then
like,
he
don't
did.
even let her see it, I think.
Right, I think so. And I'm just, like, so curious what she would have chosen in that moment.
Right. It's very possible that she convinced herself to kind of become this way because she like, that was her coping, like, accepting what had happened. Because especially you have to think, like, she's been expecting for probably approximately 9 months to have a baby. And, like, this all happens between the moment that she births the child, I guess, and, like, finding out that she doesn't have a child, right? Like this is like all this happens without her even knowing what's going on. So I can't imagine it was like an easy process after that.
Right. Doesn't excuse her actions, but
No way.
it's interesting to think about what might have happened.
Yeah, because who's to say she wouldn't have made the argument that the Henrys did, right? Like Mr. Reed makes a comment about himself being like, wow, like the Henrys did it and I just like chose to kill my child instead, But it's possible that Mrs. Reed would have taken it.
It's possible. So obviously we did talk about it earlier, kind of what happens in the theater, and we backtracked to kind of match all our storylines up because there's a few different things happening here. But basically, yeah, Adelaide Elizabeth kind of reconnects. Adelaide asks for another chance. And then they go and save everybody at the theater and kill everybody else.
Yeah.
And kind of a happy ending.
Yeah. I suppose. It's very dark, but yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting when you compare it to, like, the idea kind of being presented of second chances. Like, Job is given a second chance, and same with Adelaide, she is as well. And then you have, like, everybody in this theater just kind of, nah, we just killed them. Like, it's fine.
But in a sense, it's like, yeah, I don't know, is this discriminatory? I'm like, the young people got another chance,
Yeah, I think some people don't need a second chance because it would have been like their fifth chance. Like Mr. Reed literally considers himself a strangler. Like,
right.
We don't need to give him any more chances.
Yeah.
The Kirbys, maybe I would have left alone because of I understand where Matthew was coming from, to be fair.
I don't know. I'm
Okay.
still not on that on board with that. I think if you're gonna take out the rest, take him out too.
Damn.
But I don't know if they should have taken everyone out. Like, here's another thing, right? Is, this could get into some real moral quandary, but I understand that they were literally about to lynch a few of them, but I don't know if the response was kill so many people in return. I don't know if it feels like justice, and I don't know if there's another way to get justice. So in that way, I am like, yeah, sure, go for it. But I'm like, I don't know, like the getting the sense that Adelaide is the one who asked for all of these people to be killed. It just feels so extreme.
I guess the question is, like, is this meant to be justice at all?
Right.
You mentioned this in the first part. Adelaide has had very dark thoughts before. Like, she
true.
did burn her parents. She thought about killing her driver. She wouldn't have cared if Matthew died after Elizabeth had attacked him. She has a darker mindset in regards to what needs to be done to kind of survive and persist. I think this was just part of that, right? And we even get a scene where they burn the opera house down at the end. So I think
true.
we kind of just come full circle.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that was a parallel.
Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily justice. It's just like, we also get this theme throughout the book. Like, what do you do to survive when everything around you kind of wants to kill you, right? And I guess you do this, right?
I'll take it. I think you're right. I think it was just shocking.
Yeah, it's for sure shocking, but...
I do like, actually, now that you say that, like, I can appreciate it a little more. I do like how it parallels the beginning.
It feels satisfying in that way, but I don't think this is supposed to be, like, a justifiable act, I guess. I was going to say I don't think it's supposed to be a moral book, but I think it is. But I think more so in regards to, like, parenting is what we're really thinking about here.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the other part that makes that satisfying in a literary sense is that it does justify those parts you mentioned of, I had pointed out that Adelaide had some dark thoughts and it didn't feel like it meant much. Like it felt like just a red herring to make you think that Adelaide had done something horrible specifically and not anything else. And then that kind of like fades off a bit later on, but you're right. Like, and it did appear again with Matthew. Like that was established as a part of her character. So to me, it's like, okay, yeah, like this coming back and looping around, like that paid off. It just happened a while ago, so I kind of forgot about it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I think that's basically everything. Obviously, we've probably skipped like 50 million things that happened in the book, but you know what? Good enough.
Yeah, those are all the main points.
Yeah. So we can just get right into reviews. Do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. So I would say, I've said a little bit in allusion to what I might say here, in that the first half of the book, I did feel like was much slower than the second half, and maybe too slow. Like it did feel like the development wasn't keeping me engaged, and I don't know. I think I just really did like the vibe of having the townspeople interact a lot more, relationships, characters, getting into it much more than the like, oh, we're moving to Montana, like new world, like, oh, it's so cold, like I really liked more like, here's a community and like how this problem we've started with is going to develop into a full-fledged thing. So it's kind of a 50-50 feel for me on that. I did like the horror aspect for sure. Like I liked the development of who Elizabeth was as a creature and like kind of how she came to exist, why she exists, also that she wasn't the only one. Like those things were interesting, cool, surprising. And I definitely liked how much of an opportunity we had to talk about what the point of Elizabeth might have been, or like what does she represent, like from the parenting, trauma, shame, all of those. Like I think it was a good embodiment of a lot of things that were going on in the story. So I appreciated that part. The other things I didn't like so much, we talked about the Mexican couple kind of worshiping Elizabeth for a little bit there that I was a little bothered by. And also they like give Adelaide a drug, I think, when she drinks that sheep's milk. I was like, she's so bothered by the vibe of this whole thing, and these are the only Latinos that I've seen in the book, so it was like throwing me off from that angle. Anyway, that's a lot of words to say. I think I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5.
Oh, okay.
I just think, yeah, there are things I appreciated. I think I just wanted some more in some senses and some less in the other senses. It was a short book. I think there could have been more in the second half than there was.
For my review, for the most part, I agree with you. I think like I felt there were some things definitely lacking. The book could have probably been longer. Some relationships I think could have been developed a little bit deeper. But I did definitely also enjoy the second half more than the first half when we started getting all of those connections and things. The only other thing like I really felt was lacking was kind of the world, in the sense that we got interesting bits. Like we have Elizabeth and the Reed's kid, who are obviously non-human kind of. And then we had Grace's husband as a ghost, and we never talked about that at all.
Yeah, there are definitely some unclosed loops.
Yeah, and then we had a very interesting scene with Fiona and Adelaide where they went to that other town, and there were just ghosts there as well.
That felt like another book for a section.
Yeah, and can I just say, the atmosphere of that like chapter was amazing. It was maybe my favorite like chapter in the entire book. Just like the repetition of like haunting words and like the way it felt was it felt very perfect, I think, in my head.
It really struck Western horror.
Yes, for sure. It just felt kind of like an outlier though, within everything else happening. I think for my rating, I'm actually gonna give it a 4 out of 5.
Ooh, okay.
Because I did really like it, but yeah, I just wanted a little bit more. And of course, I say that, and if we got more, maybe I would be saying the opposite.
That's true. Yeah.
For the most part, right now, that's how I'm feeling.
Yeah, I do feel like you always have to be careful what you wish for, right, when it comes to length. Because we definitely read some books where it's like, say less, like this, we could be asking for more, and then it's like, yeah, but, what if that didn't go the way we wanted it to because we asked for more? I don't know. I think it's kind of the same thing you feel if, like, a book you like gets turned into a TV or a movie, It's like, did I actually need that change? Maybe not.
For sure.
Well, with that, we can get into good vibes to end the episode, right? Would you like to begin with that?
Yes, I can begin this one. I kind of said it, I guess. The good vibe I think I'm going to make that one ghost chapter, just the ghosts in general, I think were interesting because they were real, right? Like, they existed in this world. It kind of brings in, like, to question kind of, again, the idea of burdens and, like, do things ever actually die? Adelaide is haunted kind of by her mother, and presumably she'll probably feel that way for her entire life. Even in this abandoned town, there are still ghosts, and nothing is ever truly, like, gone. Nothing ever really completely changes. I don't know. Those kinds of ideas. I could talk about that kind of stuff forever. I think it's also interesting within this landscape in which the land is kind of trying to kick you out of it, but still you have, like, abandoned towns, and the human mark on things kind of never is truly gone from it. I don't know, just, like, leaving your mark. Interesting ideas can come. You can have an interesting conversation about all of that kind of stuff. So I think the ghosts added to that in an interesting way, and obviously added to the atmosphere. They were cool.
Yeah, I agree with you. It feels like it was a little highlight, and that with what I'm about to say for my good vibe, I think is why I would, even though I didn't rate this as high as some other books, I would still read other books like it. I felt like the highlight of this book for me was that it was a historical fiction that maintained, like, diversity and complexity in its story, right? It wasn't just a historical fiction so that way there could be justified oppression. Like, there was oppression in this book, and it was more interesting than just oppression existed. That we were able to have, complex discussions and thoughts about, like, how that oppression played into the characters' stories, like, kind of what angle people were coming from when it came to, like, racism and transphobia and things like that. Like, it wasn't the obvious all the time. We had to really think about, like, where is everyone coming from? Like, we had these kind of back and forth conversations about Matthew, for example. It wasn't using historical fiction as an excuse to give people poor behavior. It was like, historical fiction, people do have poor behavior in the past, but here's why it's important to the story. Here's why that's interesting. Just bringing it more into question than just saying it as matter of fact. And I think a big fear I often have with historical fiction is that issue of, like, oh, we're just in the past so that way people can be shitty, and we're not going to talk about it. Like, it's just that people are shitty because it's the past, and this was beyond that. It kind of brought me back on my historical fiction curmudgeonliness a little bit. And especially I did like how that combined with sort of the horror aspect that I mentioned earlier of, liking how the creature was, and like the Western bit too of, like, yeah, it feels like this vibe, like this setting for this story was kind of a good one for it. Like, and especially to bring in, like, something more than the characters are racist against Black Americans, like, to bring in, like, we have a much more complex history with racism that includes a lot more people than that. So to get a bit of that story was good too.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I think tends to get lost in historical fiction is, like, not just complexity of problems, but complexity of the community and the people. And that shows up with diversity, right? Like, a lot of times you get a historical fiction and it's like, wow, cool, now everyone's just white. Like, is this a historical fiction just so everyone can be white? Notice that in this book, most of the characters in this book are white, but most of the main characters are not, right? Like, it is a very specific story that's being told that I think it's more interesting for it, really, right? It's not just about, like, white Westerners doing white Westerner things. That is a part of the story, but really the main characters are Adelaide and Bertie and Fiona and Grace and Sam, right? And then even with that, right, we have trans characters. Like, I don't like, one of the things that also puts me off of historical fiction is I don't ever expect to see that. I don't ever expect to see, sexual gender diversity. And this book had plenty of that. So the author had, like, no concerns with putting those things in historical fiction. It shows that it can be done. And I think, even though I could have enjoyed the book more, done pretty well still. So it makes me feel like there's got to be more out there that fits those niches that I just haven't seen yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like something we kind of have gotten used to hearing is this rhetoric of queer people didn't exist before this time, right? Like, so many people are trans, not that many people, but so many people are trans because we've created it. It's a mental illness that's only existed now. It's like, no, people have always been queer. Mm-hmm. There was just not the language for it, and also people were being killed because of it. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Or they were being forced to act quote unquote normal, right? Like, we see that happening to Sam in this very book. And if Sam had been born into a different family, it's entirely possible he would have had to pretend his entire life, right? Like, that's the experience, but it's still an experience. It existed. So
yeah, and it's believable, in my opinion, like that this is a way that this might have been a trans experience someone had in the past, you know, in times where we're claiming that trans people didn't exist, right? I think it struck the right chord.
Definitely. But that's Lone Women, I suppose, for our Halloween month. It was a lot more, I was going to say lighthearted than I was expecting. I guess so.
Just like in the horror aspect, right?
Yeah, like it did have a pretty happy ending, all things considered. Nobody major died, I guess is what I'll say.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, that's a good point. We didn't lose a main character.
Yeah, I was reading the author's note for this, or the acknowledgments, basically, and the author had noted he had talked to his wife about basically the end of this book because he wasn't really sure what to do, like if some of the characters should die or like who would that be, blah blah blah. And apparently it was his wife. Let me actually just quote right from the book. Emily, his wife, said, "None of the above. Women are losing enough in the real world these days. I want the lone women to win."
I love that.
And I just think that's really nice. Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened. They won, right? They got their own community and everything.
Yeah. But that's this book. What are we reading next time, John?
So next time we're going to be reading The Lost Bookshop by Evie Woods, up to but not including chapter 31. And the vibe of this book I'm kind of describing as a combo between Midnight Library and Lonely Castle in the Mirror. The idea is it's taking place in Dublin, at least at first, and 3 strangers are pulled into a mysterious bookshop and forced to contend with the importance of their own lives. And I say that because the description of the book described them as side characters in their lives. So I think the idea is that they're really going to have to reflect upon themselves and see why they matter. So I'm excited. I'm excited for the Midnight Library vibes with the Lost Bookshop. We'll have to see, how much fantasy versus how much just like character development it is. But I'm excited.
Yeah, we're getting into the holiday season, so more sentimental books, I suppose,
cozier
is what we're going for. For sure. Obviously, if you have your own thoughts and theories on The Lone Women or this next book we're reading, our Twitter is 5050_books. We also have the Goodreads, the YouTube, and I think that's going to be it. See you next time.
All right, goodbye.